Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Loser by Thomas Bernhard. This is an incredible book. This is the fourth novel by Bernhard that I've read in the past 10 months. And of the four, it's the one that is lodged deepest into my mind, into my memory, into my heart. It's a book that I keep returning to. I reread passages from it. I reflect on the ideas that the narrator is sharing, but also what Bernhard is trying to get at. Are those the same idea? And so it is an incredible, incredible book. Like concrete, like the second half of Gargoyles, it is an extended monologue. We have a 170-page paragraph in The Loser, and it is a tunnel, as in Bernhard's other novels. He is drilling into a single consciousness. In this case, he's drilling an oil well into the pit of despair, because this is a brutally pessimistic book. Bernhard is examining relationships and friendships. He's examining language, the language that we use to communicate within our friendships. He's examining art, aspirational art, the perfectionism that can haunt artists. He's examining failure. Failure for individuals as artists, failure within our friendships, within our relationships, failure within language to be able to communicate between our friendships. And he's ultimately pushing at the idea around what do we do when our lives feel like failures, when we recognize that? How do we reconcile ourselves to the failures in our lives? And so it is a dark, dark book, but it is also a richly rewarding book. Bernhard is, of course, asking questions and pushing at the questions that humans have been demanding answers to for millennia. And so it's rewarding from that perspective. But while it is very dark, there are these shades of light circling around it. There are subtle ironies. They are incredibly subtle. This is a work that rewards very attentive reading, because otherwise it just seems overwhelmingly bleak. And yet Bernhard is pushing at ideas around, there are absurdities in our lives, and there are absurdities within these pages. And Bernhard wants a reader to notice those and to begin to question the absurdity as much as the pain and the tragedy. And so it is a tragic comedy a la Samuel Beckett, and it is a masterpiece. Let's begin and explore what's going on. We have an unnamed narrator who is stimulated to this reflection by the recent death of his friend Wertheimer. Trigger warning, as with other Bernhard works, this is a work that deals explicitly with suicide. The narrator's friend Wertheimer has died by suicide recently, and that stimulates him to reflect on their relationship and their time in the deep past as students, as piano students, and the fact that they once met Glenn Gould, the great famous pianist, that they were fellow students of his. Bernhard was not a fellow student of Glenn Gould's, but he casts himself in this way, and he looks at Glenn Gould as this perfectionist artist who is demanding of himself to be able to produce this art in a way that is comparable to the way that Bernhard seemed to want to demand of himself as an artist, as a writer. And it's an effective metaphor, but he wants to examine how Glenn, as a great pianist, very clearly cast a shadow over these two other friends, the narrator himself and their friend Wertheimer. And to a certain extent, Wertheimer became the loser explicitly. But Wertheimer's disaster had already started the moment Glenn called Wertheimer the loser. What Wertheimer had always known, Glenn said out loud, abruptly and without bias. As I have to say, in his Canadian-American way, Glenn mortally wounded Wertheimer with his loser. I thought, not because Wertheimer heard this concept for the first time, but because Wertheimer, without knowing this word loser, had long been familiar with the concept of loser. But Glenn Gould said the word loser out loud in a crucial moment, I thought. We say a word and destroy a person, although the person we've destroyed, at the moment we say out loud the word that destroys him, doesn't take notice of this deadly fact. I thought, a person confronted with such a deadly word and deadly concept still has no idea of the deadly effect of this word and its concept, I thought. Even before Horowitz's course had begun, Glenn said the word loser to Wertheimer. I thought I could even specify the precise hour in which Glenn said the word loser to Wertheimer. We say a deadly word to a person and at that moment are naturally unaware that we have actually said a deadly word to him, I thought. You'll notice a couple of repetitions there, the deadly repeated, the I thoughts that are repeated. And Bernhard does this throughout the book. There are repeated words, repeated phrases like the I thought. Repeatedly, the narrator remembers something, and he remembers something Wertheimer or Glenn Gould said, and he remembers it, and he goes, he said, I thought. It's this very conscious and insistent effort to notice that all of these interactions reside solely in the memory of the narrator, because his friends are gone. They're no longer here to be able to counter that claim, to counter his memory. It is strictly his memory that he's able to share with us. And so there's all of these ideas going on there. But the repetition creates a couple of effects. One is it creates this musical rhythmic effect. And so something that feels like, as I've said, it's not broken up as a paragraph. The sentences can be very long and wind at times. But by repeatedly putting in these he said, I thought, or I thought, Bernhard creates this rhythm that allows it to flow a little more clearly. The other piece is that the repetition is not just repetition for repetition's sake. There's a way in which the narrator seems to almost demand and insist that these thoughts are true, that this is what happened and here's how it is. And he repeatedly is like pushing this forward and insisting that the reader agree with the narrator. And it's really quite an incredible effect across the entire novel. He recalls their time as students, he recalls aspects of their later lives, but he's constantly pushing this idea around how did he reconcile with the fact that he was not as strong as a pianist as Glenn Gould was, and Glenn Gould himself even seems to pull back from the limelight and doesn't want to perform, wants to strictly perfect his art, playing the same handful of songs in the narrator's recollection, of course, in the studio, and trying to make that as precise as possible and as perfect as possible. And he thinks about his friend Wertheimer. He could never come to terms with being born into a world that basically repulsed him in every detail from the very beginning. He grew older and thought that his wish to die would suddenly no longer be there. But this wish grew more intense from year to year, without ever becoming totally intense and concentrated. My constant curiosity got in the way of my suicide, so he said, I thought. We never forgive our fathers for having sired us, nor our mothers for having brought us into this world, he said, nor our sisters for continuing to be witnesses to our unhappiness. To exist means nothing other than we despair, he said. When I get up, I'm revolted by myself and everything I have to do. When I go to bed, I have no other wish than to die, never to wake up. But then I wake up again, and the awful process repeats itself. Finally repeats itself for 50 years, he said. To think that for 50 years we don't wish for anything other than to be dead and are still alive and can't change it because we are thoroughly inconsistent, so he said. Because we are wretched, vile creatures. And then he has this epiphany. No musical ability, he cried out. No life ability. And it's just absolutely shattering. The way that the failure as a pianist has haunted Wertheimer for so many years, the way that just casually and jokingly being referred to as a loser by someone who very clearly stood as a monolith, in his path to achievement and to genius, how that has just stuck in him for that entire period of time, for the intervening, half century, is just brutal and, as I said, shattering. And there are ways in which the book begins to push at language even more and more. And so Wertheimer, in his failure as a pianist, he shifts over to become a philosopher, even though that is the nickname that Glenn Gould had given the narrator. And so he's going to write these books of aphorisms, a la Blaise Pascal with the Pensées, a la Nietzsche with his works. The mind, wherever it makes its claims felt, is finished off and locked up and, of course, immediately branded as mindless, he said, I thought, while looking up at the restaurant ceiling. But everything we say is nonsense, he said, I thought. No matter what we say, it is nonsense, and our entire life is a single piece of nonsense. I understood that early on. I barely started to think for myself, and I already understood that we speak only nonsense. Everything we say is nonsense, but everything that is said to us is also nonsense. Like everything that is said at all. In this world, only nonsense has been said until now. And, he said, only nonsense has actually and naturally been written. The writings we possess are only nonsense because they can only be nonsense, as history proves, he said, I thought. In the end, I fled into the notion of the aphorist, he said. And when asked my profession, I actually once responded, so Wertheimer said, that I was an aphorist. But people didn't understand what I meant. As usual, when I say something, they don't understand it. For what I say doesn't mean that I said what I said, he said, I thought. I say something, he said, I thought, and I'm saying something completely different. Thus, I've spent my entire life in misunderstandings, and nothing but misunderstandings, he said, I thought. We are, to put it precisely, born into misunderstanding and never escape this condition of misunderstanding as long as we live. We can squirm and twist as much as we like, it doesn't help. But everyone can see this, he said, I thought, for everyone says something repeatedly and is misunderstood. This is the only point where everybody understands everybody else, he said, I thought. One misunderstanding casts us into the world of misunderstanding, which we must put up with as a world composed solely of misunderstandings, and which we depart from with a single great misunderstanding. For death is the greatest misunderstanding of all. So Wertheimer, I thought. And it is just incredible. The way in which Bernhard, who is clearly perfecting his craft as a novelist and as a monologist in a certain way, is creating these characters who cast every stone possible at his own art. The way that he's trying to insist that we pay attention to what he has written, even as he has a character screaming that all of it is nonsense, that everything that has been written down is nonsense, that this entire conversation is nonsense, that this booktube interaction that's going on is nonsense. And it is so incredible. This idea around one misunderstanding is our birth and the other is our death. And that we are bookended by misunderstanding on either side. And in a sense, that is all we have. That we're constantly trying to ping these ideas off of each other and to try and get closer to each other. We are giving a thumbs up or giving a heart or liking something, even though we want to say something deeper, or we try to say something deeper, but we find ourselves limited by characters, limited by time, limited by barriers of technology, before technology, of just the physical geography of our communication. And so it is just this haunting meditation, as I said, about friendship, about life. And it is a book that just is constantly screaming for us to reaffirm our own lives as we're reading. We have one where in another passage, the narrator is sort of reflecting on this memory that Wertheimer shared. Basically, I hate nature, he said again and again. I myself appropriated this sentence and still repeat it to myself today. Will always repeat it, as I believe, I thought. Nature is against me, said Glenn, adopting my own philosophical perspective, for I also always say the sentence I thought. Our existence consists in always being against nature and setting to work against nature, said Glenn. Setting to work against nature until we give up, for nature is stronger than we are. We who in arrogance have turned ourselves into art products. We aren't people after all, we are art products. And so Glenn, not Wertheimer, my apologies, introduces this idea that artificiality is the key component of art. That art, in a sense, is not romantically natural. It is rather intensely artificial. That an aspiration towards perfection is going to involve correction and editing and revision. And recording a piano work is going to involve splicing recordings. Glenn Gould, the real Glenn Gould, would famously ask people to sit and try to spot where the splicings had occurred in some of his recordings, and they wouldn't necessarily get them correct. And so this idea of pushing against nature and that we're in this antagonistic relationship with nature is something that feels very close to the idea that we are born naturally, many of us will die naturally, and our entire life is this scream against nature. That even though we are in the midst of all this life in the world, we're constantly under threat in our lives, and that the act as an artist is a push against nature in some way. But he then gets at this weird fusion. So he started mentioning the art products. We aren't people after all, we are art products. The piano player is an art product, a disgusting one, he said in conclusion. We are the ones who continually want to escape from nature, but we can't do it naturally, he said. I thought we get stuck halfway. Basically, we want to be the piano, he said. Not human beings, but the piano. All our lives, we want to be the piano and not a human being. Flee from human beings we are in order to completely become the piano, an effort which must fail. Although we don't want to believe it, he said. The ideal piano player, he never said pianist, is the one who wants to be the piano. And I say to myself every day when I wake up, I want to be the Steinway, not the person playing the Steinway. I want to be the Steinway itself. Sometimes we get close to this ideal, he said, very close, at which point we think we've already gone crazy, think we're on the high road to madness, which we fear like nothing else. All his life, Glenn had wanted to be the Steinway itself. He hated the notion of being between Bach and his Steinway as a mere musical middleman, and of one day being ground to bits between Bach on one side and his Steinway on the other. He said, I thought, all my life I have dreaded being ground to bits between Bach and Steinway, and it requires the greatest effort on my part to escape this dread, he said. My ideal would be I would be the Steinway. I wouldn't need Glenn Gould, he said. I could, by being the Steinway, make Glenn Gould totally superfluous. But not a single piano player has ever managed to make himself superfluous by being Steinway, as Glenn said. To wake one day and be Steinway and Glenn in one, he said. I thought, Glenn Steinway, Steinway Glenn, all for Bach. And there's brutal credo that we hear of people who are wed to their jobs or wed to their art, or who have in a sense sacrificed their lives, and many of the choices they make are all directed towards this single-minded goal. And here we have Glenn Gould articulating, the fictional Glenn Gould, articulating this idea that he feels that he is not of the musical art or of the machine used to produce the art. He's this middle piece. He doesn't create it. He creates, he allows it. He's a conduit for it. And he wants to be more than that. He wants to be, like, in a sense, blended and melded with his art. And that fusion is something that we do, so many of us aspire to. We aspire to be the best at something, the greatest at something. And as we grow older, we see that we fail at these things. We are not the best basketball player. We are not the best piano player. We are not the best singer or the best soccer player. We are, sadly, too often, we are not the best spouse or the best parent or the best child. And so we see all of those failures, and how do we, in a sense, divest ourselves from those failures, as if by wedding ourselves to one piece of perfection, in a sense, we can discard and discount all of the other aspects of our lives that we failed at. But if we then fail at that one last piece that was our strong point, our stronghold, our citadel of perfection, what then do we become? Besides, as Wertheimer felt, a loser. And so as we think through this, Wertheimer and the narrator reflects on this idea of Wertheimer's final years and how he has experienced this failure, and he begins to think. Ultimately, he was enamored of failure, if not even a little smitten, I thought, had clung to this failure of his until the end. I could actually say he was unhappy in his unhappiness, but he would have been even more unhappy had he lost his unhappiness overnight, had it been taken away from him from one moment to the next, which is again proof that basically he wasn't unhappy at all, but happy. And by virtue of and with his unhappiness, I thought, many people are basically happy because they're up to their necks in unhappiness, I thought. And I told myself that Wertheimer actually was happy because he was continually aware of his unhappiness, could take pleasure in his unhappiness. All at once, this thought struck me as not at all absurd. That is to think that he was afraid of losing his unhappiness, and for a reason I couldn't know. And that's how he comes to decide that must have been Wertheimer's final choice, to make a choice to die by suicide. That recognizing that he didn't even have his unhappiness to hang on to, that he had lost his citadel, but now he had this sort of last cellar, and that was his unhappiness. And recognizing that he couldn't even be happy in his unhappiness anymore, there seemed to be no point. But throughout, there is this insistence that we pay attention. We pay attention to our own lives, to the measure that we use to measure our lives, and that little criteria. And yet through that, we also have this beautiful insistence on the memory, that even when we have failed, we can have this relationship with others. And even beyond the failure of language, we can have some aspect of our lives reside in the memory of a friend or of a colleague or of a family member. And that perhaps is an aspect of life that we need to pay attention to and need to appreciate. And we need to be able to think of ourselves perhaps as the repository of someone else's, genius, of their moment of success, rather than just as a repository of failure. So, as I said, it's an incredible book. It is one that I highly, highly recommend. It is one that I know I'm going to reread. So let's think about some other works. I've, in the past, read Gargoyles, which is nearly as brutal. Here we have almost wild ravings in the monologue from the prince at the end. Concrete, it feels a little bit closer to the loser. And there does seem to be a difference, particularly with Gargoyles and the loser, where in the early works of Bernhard's novels, they seem to be a little more fictional. There isn't necessarily a clear individual from history or from life in Austria or music or philosophy that he's pushing at. Here, in the second half, final decade or two of his career, after his autobiography has been published, his memoirs, Gathering Evidence, he seems to push at wanting to talk explicitly about the philosopher Wittgenstein, of Glenn Gould, of other individuals who were real humans, and to kind of play with them and explore aspects of their lives and fuse their lives with his own. Concrete, I think, really pushes at many of the same ideas around relationships, around the affirmation that we can give to each other, even when our relationships seem to be failing. And this was the first Bernhard work I read. There are so many parallels, just in terms of philosophy, the tragicomic existential ideas, but also in terms of the style, the extended monologues, the fact that there are questions asked without answers, the nameless nature of characters and narrators in Samuel Beckett, particularly I would say the trilogy, and maybe even more specifically, Malone Dies, I think. The way that we have a narrator who says he's going to tell a story and then it breaks it up and tells parts of a story and aspects of another. This feels perhaps closest to what Bernhard achieves. But I would also add his plays. I think for some reason I kept thinking about the play Not I, the monologue that repeats itself a couple of times and breaks and changes and expands and amplifies. But that is, I think, an absolutely masterful piece, and there's an incredible performance of it that I'll link in the description box below. I thought, of course, of No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. This is, I think, heads in a different direction, but examines many of the same ideas. The aphoristic nature of Wertheimer's failures, and the way that the narrator talks about he's trying to write this essay on Glenn Gould and this analysis of him, and yet he just keeps kind of throwing out his notes or feeling like he needs to start over. He's going to complete the manuscript and burn it. Has, I think, comparisons to the Book of Disquiet, Fernando Pessoa, and the way that these scribblings and rambles were found in a trunk, sort of organized to be edited, to be published, and to be read and examined. There are ideas around, I would say, as a counterpoint to some of the philosophies of Bernhard or of his characters that might be found in the Phaedo from Plato, and also around life, and also, I would say, around friendship and relationships in the Crito. Of course, the Pensées of Blaise Pascal. There are aspects, I think, that are pretty clear around Schopenhauer's essays that feel very as a deep influence on Bernhard. Kant as well, particularly with the idea that we're constantly, pushing mind against mind, or sort of pushing at each other, and that the idea of our perceptions of reality exist solely within our mind. There's something about the characters that feel close to Zarathustra, this powerful, deep identity and wisdom that reside, that also feels a little bit like this mad monologue. And as I mentioned, of course, the influence of Wittgenstein on Bernhard's life, on his philosophy, on the way that the Tractatus is composed in a sense of a series of logical aphorisms. It's quite incredible. And the other work I was thinking a little bit of was Abel and Cain by Gregor von Rezzori. I haven't read this in full, but I've read passages from it, and I'm interested in reading this as I've read more Bernhard to get a sense of if those parallels exist. So I hope you're doing well. I've been fortunate to be discussing these works from Bernhard with Jason from Channel of a Disappointed Man and some others as we read these, and I'm really enjoying them. I'm really learning a lot from them. So I hope everybody's doing well.